because she had.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. This is day 4 of our workshops. It's been an amazing week. We've had just great speakers. We're really happy to be hosting Don Bies today. Thanks so much for coming in. As you all know, our film festival is tomorrow. Don's film, Keep the Gaslight Burning, is playing in the noon show, right, tomorrow. Yeah. So you can check that out. He might be talking a little bit about that today. That film is the film that Bill from yesterday shot. So that's going to be fun for you to watch, especially hearing the context of some of the behind the scenes. We have this workshop today at 1:30. We have another workshop in here. We switched to this room because it's just better. We've got 2 actors from the film Clack who flew in from Paris yesterday. They'll be coming in talking about directing and or acting, working with directors. And then at 4 o'clock we have Valerie from DreamWorks is going to be coming in talking about her 24-year, she still works there, 24 years of working in animation. So that's going to be really awesome. That'll also be in here. So without further ado, let's welcome Don. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you. So when we talked originally, he says, "Hey, can you do a workshop?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I don't know what I can show you." So a little background about me. I started in the film business in 1985 on a movie called The Fly with Jeff Goldblum and David Cronenberg. I moved out from Chicago. I was doing theater in Chicago. I was a big film buff in Chicago, but there wasn't much happening there. So moved out here to San Rafael, and that's where The Fly was. We made The Fly. We made the creature The Fly, and through that, then I ended up working at Industrial Light and Magic. Unfortunately, most of my career is gone. I mean, the kind of work that we used to do is gone. There's the practical effects and model work and stuff like that. However, having now moved on as a filmmaker myself, having that knowledge is incredibly helpful. But at the same time, I love digital technology and what you could do with it. And we did in our film, if you see it tomorrow, we did a lot of digital tricks in there. We shot in a house here in Petaluma that, although it was an old house, it had modern fixtures, so we had to digitally remove those, and that sort of thing. So we did a lot of stuff like that. But so what I kind of, this is more of a bit of a retrospective of the old-fashioned way, the way we used to make movies, it's some of them you might be familiar with the technology. I'm sorry for it's a little basic. I'm really loose. I don't have a real plan here, so but feel free to ask questions or anything. But I'll start out with this. Was actually. I worked in the Industrial Light and Magic model shop from about 1987 until they sold the model shop to a company called Kerner Optical in 2006. And then I worked there for a year or 2, and then I left. And I started my own shop here in Petaluma for a while. We did some stuff. Unfortunately, the ILM model shop is no longer. So this was a little bit of a retrospective of the work we did there. I didn't work on all these films. Some of the ones at the end I did, but it's always kind of fun. People like seeing the old stuff. So, reload the player. Technology. See, the damn digital technology, you just can't count on it. There you go. Where's the? How do I get back to the pictures?
Sorry, you see my Spotify playlist.
There you go. Yes, towards the end of the model shop's career, we ended up blowing up more stuff. that was kind of what we were regulated to. And sorry, there's another video playing here.
If you want the other video, it's the tab to the left.
Yeah, I see that. Yeah, but in the early days, ILM was formed in, for those of you who don't know, was formed in 1975 in Van Nuys, California, to do Star Wars. With the runaway success of Star Wars, George Lucas wanted to move them up here because he was a Marin-based. So they moved into a warehouse in San Rafael, and then started on Empire Strikes Back. After that, then they started getting hired out to do other films. So then they did, Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is a George film, but E.T., and then it just spiraled. So I was really fortunate. I came along there in about 1987, 88, and I was real fortunate to be at the kind of the tail end of the golden age. In 93, Jurassic Park came out. Jurassic Park was originally meant to be stop motion dinosaurs, and Dennis Muren, who was I think the most won Academy Award person that's still alive. He said, "I think we can do this digitally." So that's how the whole digital revolution started. At that point, we all saw the writing on the wall, and we started most of our work started going digitally. However, in those first 10 years of that period, the digital technology was such that it was still too expensive and still too complicated to do, so we got to do a lot of stuff. And by the time the Star Wars prequels rolled around, which I did work on a lot, we had more model makers, and there were more models made for the Star Wars, for Revenge of the Sith. There was more models made for that film than all three original Star Wars films combined. And we actually had a crew of about 100 people working on that film. But whereas the original model shop in, I think Star Wars was 12 or something like that. So we were churning out a lot of stuff. So there was a lot of misnomer for a while there that the digital, it was all digital. It really wasn't. I was just going to go through some of the things that ILM's done. Some of these pictures you'll see were actually in that little reel. This is one of the earliest things that and it's still actually a valid filming technique is matte paintings. And this is a matte painting from Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's when they were leaving to go, he was going overseas to find the Ark of the Covenant. They found this airplane was used to be owned by Howard Hughes. And they found it in a parking lot in Richmond. Actually, it had been in a warehouse, and then after Hughes died, they didn't know what to do with it, so somebody bought it, and it sat in a parking lot. So it was sitting in a parking lot, and that's how they shot it. So they actually they built a little dock, and they got a bunch of ILM people to stand there. They could start up one engine. So you see in the movie, it's one engine starts. That's the only one they could start. And then all the flying scenes were done by a model years later. But the matte painting, so going back to that original thing, everything but the airplane and the dock is a painting. And it was painted by hand on oil, with oil on glass. And in the old days, the matte painting painters used to the glass was more valuable to them than the painting itself, so they would scrape off the paint and use another one. Fortunately, Lucasfilm and ILM kept a lot of their glass paintings, so they still exist. This one does, the water was composited in as well. That water was real. The technique of the matte painting is still valid today, and you still could shoot it, digitally. You could still do it. Matter of fact, we did a little film about 10 years ago through ILM. It was kind of a competition that we did, and we did our own glass painting where we actually painted on glass, set it up, and shot through it. And then another early technique that has been around since silent film era was the stop motion. And again, excuse if you, I'm sure you all know what stop motion is, but it's moving at one frame at a time. And this is the size of the walkers from, can you open it? There you go. From Empire Strikes Back. And the guy in the blue shirt right in the center is a guy named John Berg. The guy with his head to the back of the camera right there, that's Phil Tippett. John was responsible for doing the walkers, and Phil was responsible for doing the tauntauns, the little snow lizards. And they filmed it old school, like they would have done in King Kong, the original King Kong movie. They actually had a painted backdrop. The snow was baking soda. And they moved him one frame at a time. And John has become a very good close friend of mine and a mentor over the years. And he was telling me stories that they didn't want to break the setup in between because essentially you're shooting time lapse as you're shooting this thing, so lights have to start dimming and you have all sorts of issues, and they didn't have the digital technology to fix that in those days. So he said they didn't want to break the setup for this one shot. And they went for 32 hours straight animating. They would go for 12, 14, 18 hours or so shooting and get 5 seconds of film maybe on there. But the one that he said they did 32 hours, he was tired of the walkers all moving in straight, one straight line. So he thought he'd have them turn. So he had the whole thing walking, and then it turned, shot a snow speeder, and then continued walking towards the camera. And they ended up only using like 3 seconds of it in the film, but it was a much longer shot. So all that work. That's Phil in the background and John close up.
Didn't Tippett have its own studio after this?
He still does to this day, yeah, over in Emeryville, Oakland, near Oakland, yeah. And matter of fact, his company did some digital effects for our film. The little gauges are called surface gauges, and the machinists use them to measure things, but stop motion animators use them to indicate how far they've gone from the last frame to the next frame. So they'll put those up, hold them there, move the thing, and then take them away, shoot, and then put them back, and they measure different points of where the thing is in space. It's incredibly complex and a whole different way of thinking. This is what all the parts it takes to make a walker. I think there's 2 walkers in there, but the bodies were model kit parts bashed together and molded, but the legs were entirely machined, custom machined and designed. John designed the armature so that when the leg would move, the pistons on the arms would move up and down, so he didn't have to do all that ancillary animation. They did have a larger walker for all the tripping and falling over shots. So when its head exploded and dropped off and everything like that, you see Ted is the stage hands there. He's wearing a mask because again they also used glass beads in the snow to give it a little short sparkle to it, and it was really bad for your lungs, so they all have masks on. But there's actually in the film there's an error, sort of a mistake. When the one head blows off and the leg kind of twitches and it falls over, if you watch really carefully, there was John that was underneath with a stick poking it up, and you could see the stick come up briefly. The tauntauns again were more Phil's baby, the opening shot of Empire Strikes Back, after they were in space and they go down, and there's a long tracking shot of the tauntaun running along the snow. That was one of the earliest tries that they did at match moving, essentially. So they filmed a plate in Norway with a helicopter, and then they were able to plot and this is all done by hand. There's no computer involved with it. They plotted by hand the same motion, the movement of the camera. Because they had the computer-controlled cameras, they were able to feed that information into the computer, into the cameras. And mind you, the cameras, the way they used to store the information on those computers were cassette tapes. And then Phil animated it running. So again, from a technology standpoint at that time, it was an incredibly difficult shot to pull off, but they were able to do it. Wrong way. What they would do, but for the Tauntauns, they studied horses to get the gallop and everything like that. That's one of the hallmarks of any practical effects or even animation, is to study real life and try to use as much real life reference as possible. So they filmed horses running. For the walkers, they filmed elephants walking. Matter of fact, the elephant that was the study model for the walker was also the bantha in Star Wars that the Sand People run onto, and she used to live in Vallejo. She died a few years ago. Margie was her name. So, and then every stop motion animation puppet has an armature underneath, and again, it's all custom armature. And then around it was put a foam latex injected into it and cured. And then I think for the Tauntaun, it was a rabbit pelt that they used, that they shaved down. So for Rocketeer as well, as recently as Rocketeer, they used stop motion. So all the flying shots were mainly was a stop motion puppet. Tom Santamon, who was one of the animators on Empire Strikes Back as well, did that. For Indiana Jones, you saw it in the Indiana Jones Temple of Doom, that you saw it in there. They needed a mine chase sequence, and so those were actually stop motion puppets, and they made up their own motion control tracking system with a model track, and they took a Nikon camera, a still Nikon camera. They made a special pack for it on the back to run film through it, so they could shoot it one frame at a time. And then they pulled it along basically on a string. The string was motorized, and that's how they got all those shots, those POV shots, like a roller coaster and everything like that. And they could also, you could see there's the gear set up in there, so they could do a pan and tilt as well. And then so all the stuff being chased, where the mine cars being chased. Well, there's you can see a bit of the motors and everything. The walls were tin foil. With frames around them, and the inside was painted. I think he's pulling a cable through there. But then there's Tom again. He's stop motion animating the puppets as the camera was following through. So they're not always stop motion animated. Sometimes they're just static going through because they're going so fast. But then again, the armatures for those puppets, and then there's the puppets themselves. So. Now, in the old days, the way this is a optical printer, and so to composite several pieces of film together, you would actually have to have your elements of other things you shot, and then you'd have to have a camera, and they would. I'm simplifying this greatly. It's far more complex than I even understand. But essentially, on the left side there is a camera, on the right side is a projector, and they aim at each other, and that's how they would put all those things together, and then sometimes roll the film back and then re-expose it again. To think that they did this for all the for any composite shots in the old days. Is staggering, because it's so easy now in After Effects or even Premiere or DaVinci, where you could just key out the green or blue or whatever and just put the background in and little color correction, you're done. This literally took days to do, and having to get it right, and not also having to wait the next day for the film to be developed and that sort of thing. So it shows a little bit of a process. Obviously, they're shooting that's Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher down in San Rafael. They were shooting it at ILM's blue screen. Now, one time ILM had one of the biggest blue screens, and the blue screen had to be photographically pure for them. and it had to be a specific blue. It had to couldn't have any blemishes, and it was illuminated by these huge banks and banks and banks of fluorescent lights, and they were able to control also the frequency of the current so that it wouldn't flicker with the camera system. So there's all this, again, this ancillary technology that had to be thought of as they were doing it was staggering at the time. So you couldn't just hold up a sheet and get your green screen or your blue screen shot. People had to come up to ILM to their stages, and so we got to meet a lot of celebrities that way, you know. We had the biggest blue screen for a while there. So this is a series of images that shows the process of the matting. So there's the raw footage, and then this would be the mat. Now the darker area around it is called the garbage mat, and that was just to block out the majority of it. So they essentially had to create two mats. They had to create white with black, white being what the image was going to see, what you were going to see. The black would go away and would be exposed with whatever's behind it. And then they had to do the reverse, and run all that through. There's the reverse version of that, and they had to run that all through the optical printer so that they could get the final composite. Like I said, I'm totally simplifying it. I don't even understand how it worked, but I'm just glad we don't have to do it anymore. Stop motion was also used. This is a movie called Dragonslayer. They also tried something in Dragonslayer. This is a movie from the early 80s where it's called go motion. One of the problems with stop motion is it's so clean because it's essentially one frame of film and it's perfectly exposed and everything like that. So what they were doing with go motion was, since they had a computer-controlled camera, they put the puppet itself on a computer-controlled arm, and as they exposed the film, they would move it ever so slightly to introduce a blur. And so thus, it wasn't as clean, it didn't look as clean of an image, and it looked a little bit more fluid in its motion. They also, in some parts of Dragonslayer, they actually attached legs and everything to those go motion things so that they could all move at the same time. So it's not just the whole thing moving as a unit. In E.T., which you saw in the trailer, was bicycles, where the riders of flying was all done in miniature. They did shoot the kids in blue screen, but for all the flying distance shots. What determined the scale of this model was the smallest chain they could find to make the bike chain. And they found one that was from a camera drive or something like that. And then they built the model to that scale. And someone sculpted the figures and they clothed them, and they were loosely jointed so that if the pedals actually worked, the whole thing actually worked, so that when they spun the back tire, their legs would pedal like a real pedal. And they also had they weren't stop motion. They actually filmed them more live. They had rods on the back of the head. They did this with also the speeder bikes from Return of the Jedi. They had rods so that they could turn their heads while they're driving. So they puppeteered them a little bit while they're going along. And that's the ship from E.T. One of the things that happens a lot of times with models that we do either get blown up or the studio decides they don't have any room for them and they throw them away. Fortunately, this apparently resides in Steven Spielberg's office, so this model survived. But it had a very complex system where the legs came out and were deployed and that sort of thing. Did a lot of flying shots. That's San Rafael. That's the Canal District in San Rafael. And that's the plane from Indiana Jones' Temple of Doom when it hits the mountain and then goes into crashing. And you can see the wire system up above. And that goes back to the old days of how they used to fly airplanes in movies. There's another movie called Alive. Again, just in the backlot of ILM. And this is where the digital technology started helping, because one of the biggest things that was always a problem with any rigging that we would have to do is how do you hide that stuff? And now this was at the advent of the digital compositing, and so they could actually erase the rigs. So they were able to film the rig right in the shot with it, and then just digitally remove the rig. This was for Alive. I can't remember the name of it. The Spielberg with the firefighters. Always, thank you. So these were models. They originally tried to make the models. They were going to make the models. They put gasoline engines, lawnmower engines in them, and were going to try to fly them as radio-controlled airplanes. But then they needed to try to track them flying, so they thought, oh, we'll get an ultralight and track them with a camera. Because they didn't want a helicopter because the downdraft might damage it. I mean, it might cause, make it crash. So the problem was that the ultralight couldn't keep up with the model because they had to fly at a certain speed to stay aloft, and then they had a heck of a time trying to land them constantly. So they got rid of that idea and ended up just going with planes on wires. So all in that trailer I showed, all the stuff the airplanes flying were models going through the burning forest. Those are all Christmas trees that they acquired, and they went down somewhere in the South Bay, and it was an old metal plant where they would form metal. So they had the steel ceilings and steel buildings so that they didn't burn down the building when they did this. The first time they lit this up, apparently, though, they found out there were pigeons there because they all fell dead from the ceiling. So, and then they did some stuff outside too, where there was all the Christmas trees, and then they go. So, again, more just the flying. Joe Johnson, who is now a director, he started out at ILM. He was a art director at ILM on Star Wars. That was his very first film, and he designed, the Millennium Falcon and a bunch of iconic stuff. And then he went to film school in the early '80s, and his first film he got to direct was Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and he since directed Captain America, the first Captain America movie, Wolfman, a bunch of other films. But he was the second unit director on this. So this was an interesting shot. They wanted the airplane to come as close to the camera as possible. I don't know if you could see that. As close to the camera as possible, but they didn't want to either break the camera or kill the camera operator. So they filmed in a mirror, and they actually went right through the mirror, so they just broke the mirror. Bill, who some of you might have met yesterday, he and I we used to do these every 15-minute programs around the Petaluma schools where drunk driving. We wanted to do the same thing, so inspired by this, we got a big mirror, and I drove a car through it, and it looked like the car was coming right at you. So. This is from Pearl Harbor. This is one of the ones where the ship, we made this really beautiful museum quality model of basically the Arizona, and unfortunately they decided that they could get most of the shots digitally, so they didn't need our real nice model. So it was relegated to burning some shots, and I'm going to jump ahead to this one. And also that, that's actually the same model. And there's a funny story where we had this gorgeous model where, we're like, okay, we want to turn it into the sunken Arizona. And so one of the model makers, Dave, he gets out the Sawzall, and he's like, are you sure about this? Because, the thing had to break, it had to be cut in half. And he's like, are you sure about this? And they're like, anybody want to make one more call? Are you sure about this? And they say, yeah, go for it. So he starts cutting, he starts at the top, and is going all the way around. Just as he almost gets to the other end, the phone rings and says, you know what, wait a minute.
Oh my God.
But by that point, it was too late. So anyway, they shot it. Like I said, you saw some of the burning stuff that was earlier. And then now we have the the sunken Arizona, and.
That shot is not underwater.
It is not underwater, and that's what I was going. Yeah, that's what I was going to mention. Yeah, we should have little bubbles coming up from his. These guys could hold their breath for a long time. Hunt for Red October. This film. There's another picture I've got from AI, artificial intelligence. There's all these underwater shots that we did, and they got really good at filming them in. Go ahead. Filming them in essentially it's a smoke atmosphere, and by putting the lights up ahead and having gobos on it that rotated with the light reflecting through and just like flickering through, you get this amazing look of being underwater. And digitally, what they would do then later is sometimes add the particles or whatever. Here's a shot from this is from AI, and. Again, shot in the same way. And again, like I said, we were relegated more into crashing things and blowing things up later. I'm not sure if this one was in the trailer thing I showed, but that's Michael Bay with the B-25 from the Doolittle raid from Pearl Harbor. And this is the sequence of it coming through. So there's a track that brings the model in. That's the camera under the towel there, and it comes through and had staged pyro to explode in front of it. We also built this isn't for it, but it was in the trailer was Tokyo being bombed. That was all a miniature city that they flew cameras over on wires and blew it up. This is from Backdraft. This was in the film. In that film I showed it, I think it was Kurt Russell running along the building. And this is the final composite how it looked in the film. And then this is what the model shot. And again, everything was rigged to be where we could to reuse it. So the parts of the ceiling would fall down and then be able to be reset. Obviously, the stuff that burned had to be replaced, but there was waiting in the wings was pieces that were ready to.
So you would like score it and make pieces that you would for where we would fracture.
Yeah. Yeah, we tried to, the whole process of like trying to figure out a physical effect like that was actually working backwards a lot of times. It's like, how do you want it to come apart? And it's like, okay, so we have to cut that. Some of it took experience, some of it was just blind, stupid luck, that it came apart in the right way. Sometimes it didn't, and they had to do it again. I'll show you a picture, tell you a story of one time it didn't work. But yeah, this is the model from that. And again, it was real glass to blow out. And we would have, if it didn't, the first take didn't work, there'd be another set of panes waiting to be put in and try to reset where you could. This is from Back to the Future, the train being pushing. The DeLorean actually, they had several, this was the larger DeLorean model. The one that actually flew, I've got some pictures of it, was a smaller model, but this is, I can't remember what scale it was, but it's about that big. And this was shot right in San Rafael, right behind our ILM building. But the scene of it going off, that's actually Novato. There was a quarry there. There's apparently houses there now, but they did this twice. They got it in the first take, but they said they had a second model built for insurance. So they said, let's just do it again. So they did it again, and. But yeah, there was something like 6 or 8 cameras shooting on it. There's a camera up in that crane, so. And then the one that flew away was a motion control model, which was shot on ILM stage, which was all mechanized to do all the different things that it did do. Statue of Liberty and Ghostbusters 2. That was a lot of fun shoot. There's a lot of creatures and model stuff in that one, and that's them shooting. Again, the city was all a model. And that is an actor named Jim Fye, and he was literally glued into the suit. So you wear the robe, and he also played like 3 ghosts in Ghostbusters 2. If you remember the movie at all, there's the 2. In the courtroom scene, there's 2 ghosts, the Scoleri brothers. Yeah, he was Nunzio or Tonio, I can't remember. He was a tall, skinny one, whatever. And he's also a ghost jogger, and I think he's one other ghost in there. He was a resident ghost. This was a fascinating technology. I'm not sure if it was actually was used prior to this, but they really developed the technology further for Close Encounters of the Third Kind. This is actually from Raiders of the Lost Ark, but it's cloud tank technology. And the way it was kind of discovered was somebody was putting their creamer in their coffee, and they're like, hey, that looks like a cloud. And so they got the idea that if you can inject a medium, in this case it was tempera paint, into water, it would billow out like a cloud. So in Close Encounters, there's all these amazing cloud formations, and they were all shot like this. And essentially what it is, they created an inversion layer. So the first layer of water was, I can't remember which is heavier, salt water or fresh water, but whatever, it was one of those. Then they would put a thin layer of plastic in, and then put the second layer in, which is the opposite, whether it was salt or fresh. And then they would let it settle, and then they would carefully pull out that little thin sheet of plastic, and then they'd let it settle. And then in this case, this is a guy named Gary, he developed this. They used a little robotic arm, and they would inject the tempera paint in around, and the paint would stay in that upper layer so that they could look underneath it and film from the lower layer, and then they could light it and everything like that. So the problem is then once you shoot, then the process has to all be done all over again, and it would take a day to clean it all out. But that was a very popular technology in the late 70s, early 80s to use. Another one that they did was they used the same cloud tank there, and this is one of the ghosts from Raiders of the Lost Ark that whip around the Nazis, and they made these little puppets with silk coming off of them, and they had them on wires, and they just would go, just do that through the water, and in slow mo, they used a higher rate of frame rate. And it was able to give that ethereal effect. That's a guy named Steve Gawley. He was a model shop supervisor and model builder, amazing craftsman. And he started on Star Wars and worked all the way to the end of the ILM model shop. And he literally lives about 3 blocks away from here. So. And then in Raiders, getting into some of the creature stuff, this is Tote. Now, Tote, you all know what happens to Tote. Yeah. This was actually a guy named Chris Wayless, who, that's the other guy. He gets shriveled up. That's Chris. Chris, who happened to be my first boss when I worked on The Fly. Chris developed this, and again, he didn't develop the original technology, but what they essentially did was they took a life cast of Ronald Lacey, the actor that played him, in that pose. From that life cast, they were able to pull a press from it. They put clay into it. He cleaned it up, the sculpture, made it look a little bit better, and then made a mold of that, and then laid in layers and layers of gelatin. It's not actually wax like some people think. It's actually gelatin, so like Jell-O essentially, but colored Jell-O. And he did it in different layers, different thicknesses, different colors. He put in veins, other things, blood vessels, and then backed it all up with a plaster skull. They popped it up in front of the camera. And then through a time-lapse photography, actually, was they had 2 huge propane tanks, heaters, those barrel kind, and they just blasted it with hot air and just sat there and watched it melt, and that's what he did. Now, to expose all the way to the skull, because it's time-lapse, you'll see it if you watch the sequence in the film. The glasses are there, and all of a sudden they drop off. They in between frames they fell. But they did this one a little differently. They use again the same life cast structure thing, but this was made of latex, and essentially it had a skull structure underneath that they had air tubes in, and they sucked all the air out of it, and then, so that's how that happened. And I believe Joe Johnson, the guy I talked about earlier, he's the hand. He's holding his throat. He put his hand up on it. So again, Raiders of the Lost Ark. This was a model of the the Nazi submarine going to the island. This was filmed out in Richardson Bay, right off of San Rafael there. There's a continuity thing that a lot of people talk about or have talked about in Raiders. How did Harrison or Indiana Jones get to the island without drowning? Because he was just hanging on top of the deck. There was a scene filmed where he's holding onto the periscope, and then there's shots of him. Now you see the little doll on the periscope there. I don't know if you can see it. But they did shoot that scene, and they just cut it for time. So this is that's Steve again working on the DeLorean from Back to the Future, and they had the original DeLorean made for the first film. All it had to do was fly at the end of the very first film. Well, Back to the Future 2, they needed to do more with it. So they took the original model and ripped it apart and put an interior and a whole inside structure to it, and you could see it's jam-packed with motors and electronics so that it could do all the things it had to do. This is from Rocketeer. This is the Zeppelin, and earlier I mentioned about when it doesn't go right. They built this with this was the late 80s, and they outsourced all the grid work to a company that did laser cutting, and so that's all birch plywood laser cut in those shapes, and it was built essentially like a real Zeppelin was at the time. It was supposed to be the Hindenburg, although it wasn't. It was modeled as the Hindenburg, and so it assembled really nicely together. They had the stringers and everything. They covered it with a fabric that they use for models, except this one had, I believe, they had to get it from Europe or something like that. Anyway, it took a long time to make this model. It's 33 feet long, I think it was. That's them prepping to film it, and then it blows up. And it had to be built that way because they wanted it to blow up realistically. So they took it out, and they had warned the production. They said, we always usually build 2 of these. Well, the production's like, you don't need 2. What could go wrong? And so they said, no, we should build 2. Fortunately, Steve had the wherewithal to order 2 of everything, although they didn't build 2. They only built the 1. Well, they got it out. It was out in Hamilton Field in Novato. Up on the wires, and it was supposed to, if you remember the movie, the guy blows up in the gondola, so it was supposed to start at the front of the ship and progress all the way through. Big plot point, because our heroes are running on the top being chased by the thing, so it had to go in a proper sequence and everything like that. Well, they got it up there, and then the last thing that would be 2 pyrotechnic charges that would sever the cables and drop it out of frame. So that was the whole thing. Now, mind you, when you shoot explosives, everything goes really quick, and it's all slowed down. They shoot these things at 200-300 frames a second or something like that. And so they, everyone's ready, charges are armed, roll camera, an action, and first pyro event goes off, and then the one in the tail goes off, and then the 2 wires go off, and then the whole thing falls and it explodes all on the ground. So it was totally unusable. The footage was totally unusable. And so then it was like, now what do we do? So fortunately, like I said, Steve had ordered 2 of everything. But now the deadline of the production of the film was coming up, where they needed, the first one took like 3 months to build, So now, so they put a 24-hour around-the-clock crew on it. And I think they did it in several weeks, and they built it again, and the second time they shot it, and that's what's in the film, was the second one. So this is another one that a lot of people, this is from Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. A lot of people don't know that these whales are not real, and it's not digital either. What they did at the time, they developed, that's the sculpt of the actual whale. A guy named Walt Conti, who was from Stanford, a Stanford robotics, I think, guy, he worked with the team, and they developed self-swimming whales. So they were little radio-controlled whales that could wave their tails and actually and swim through the water. so they built 2 of them, and that's them filming them. There's one shot in the film. A lot of people thought it's real footage. There's one shot in the film of the whales breaching the water, and that was actually stock footage of actual whales. So yeah, that's there. And again, in the cloud tank, they shot them in the cloud tank. They shot them in swimming pools, and they're shooting all over the place. This is just to show a bit of a progression of how we would approach building a model. This is for a movie called Peter Pan. This was right after Pirates of the Caribbean came out. For whatever reason, all of a sudden we were building pirate ships a lot. And so we did, I think in the course of like 5 years, I was responsible for supervising the build of something like 10 ships. Not all of them were pirate ships. One of them was the ferry from War of the Worlds, Steven Spielberg's War of the Worlds. But this was the Jolly Roger. This was Captain Hook's ship. So this was the artwork that they gave us. And so we also had blueprints from the set, from the production, which happened to be shooting in Sydney, Australia. And they were building a live action set, so the whole deck was built full size. We had to build the rest of the ship. And so we took their model, which they happened to build in 3D. I took it into a 3D program. We broke it down. We had to create the stations. That's what all these things show. And then we had a 4-foot by 8-foot laser cutter that basically cut out all the stations out of 1/2-inch plywood. In this case, it was apple ply. And we laid a keel and we built the whole ship together. That's actually the pieces being pulled off of the laser cutter after they were pulled off the laser cutter. So you could see the structure. And then we had to start planking it, so it was easier for us to do it upside down. We took Italian poplar, which is 1/8-inch Italian poplar, which was real bendy, and we were able to first do this angled thing where we got it laying nice and even on there. Then we came back and did it the other way at 45 degrees to it, or 90 degrees to it, so backwards. And then over that we took 1-inch wide by I think 1/4-inch thick pine doorstop. Actually, it's a doorstop that you buy, and we planked it with that. So that's the first guide for us to start the planking process, and we eventually had a whole ship. The great thing about doing it in the computer like we did it was that it went quite quickly actually. Dave Murphy and I, one of the guys in the photos, were able to get it to this stage in about a week. So, and then we had all the deck detail. This is where it got complicated, but the deck in this case is laser cut plywood. So it's a one sheet of plywood with the lines all cut into it. So we didn't have to individually put all those lines on, all those things on there. But all that handwork on the doors and that sort of thing, as Dave laying some detail pieces on the outside. We didn't always get the planking right, so that's Bondo there. And so we'd have to go back in and score over to make the planking lines. Some of the detail, the cannons. The little round things were sculpted by hand and cast, molded. And you can see some of the deck detail. Not sure if actually this might be this might be from Pirates of the Caribbean, the ship. Like I said, we built so many. All the detail that we did put on the ship. This was the back of the ship. They called it the grimace. They wanted to look like a face that's like grimacing, so you could see the 2 eyes and the mouth and the teeth are supposed to be that. I guess the flags there. And yes, then that is Adam Savage from Mythbusters. All the Mythbusters except Carrie worked with us at ILM. So Adam and Tori, Jamie I worked on a couple films with, and Grant Imahara used to work at Skywalker Ranch. I worked out at Skywalker Ranch, and he worked in the home THX division, and his first job was trying to destroy speakers. So he was busting things for a long time. So anyway, so that's it, again in process. And then the final ship, when we pulled it outside to do some photography, it had real sails and real rigging. We had a shipwright that we worked with that taught us how to build and rig a ship properly. This ship happened to be in snow and ice in one scene. So that's wax, baking soda, all sorts of things to make it look like. Now, one of the interesting things about this was, if I can go back to, well, there's that. Remember the shape of that hull, because you'll see it's very different from the shape of that hull. So what had happened is we were 3 weeks from finishing it. It was ready to move into the paint department and start getting painted. And there was a question that came from live action production about how far out our cannons are sticking out of the gunnels here. And we took a picture, and we had to point out that, well, they don't stick out because the shape of the hull, where did I do with that photo? The shape of the hull really came out and down like that. And also the windy has to walk the plank at one point, so how far out will that plank have to be? And so, well, if you only go out this far, she wouldn't hit the water. She'd hit the side of the ship first because it comes out so far. So photographs went over to Sydney, and a call came back. It's like, okay, yeah, I like how far out your guns are sticking, but why is the hull shaped like that? And we're like, because that's what the artwork showed us. Oops. That's because that was the artwork was. The artwork had this really voluptuous hull. And the director goes, I don't like it. So we're like, what do we do now? So after a lot of finger pointing and a lot of curse words, it was decided to remake the ship. So we looked at ways of taking the one that we had, because, like I said, it had this like long, wide thing of cutting it at the keel, splitting it, forcing it together, and it's like, you know what? It'd just be easier to start from scratch. So since we had the computer model, we were able to recut all the laser cut. We were able to save all the deck detail. We were able to save a lot of this back detail. But that is the second ship that was in the film. So always get those directors to sign off. Don't trust the director. This is from Pirates of the Caribbean. This is just Danny here doing some aging detail on it. We had different scales in the ships. This is, I think it was at 1/12 scale. And then the Black Pearl, for instance, in Pirates was 1/6 scale. I think that Peter Pan ship was 1/10 scale. They could never keep it straight. So, but that's what one of the ships looked like. This was eventually reused in Pirates 3 as this was the Dauntless. Was it the Dauntless? It was used for the Endeavor that blows up at the end of Pirates 3. So we didn't blow up this model, but we made a 1/6 scale model that we stuck in a tank and did explode. So this is an interesting shot. George, that's George Lucas with the USC jacket on in the center there. George always liked to shoot, when he shot his films, he would like to shoot them and then look at them in the editing, because he really created everything in the editing room, and then go back and do pickup shots and inserts and stuff like that, things that he needed and missed. And it's kind of become a little bit of a standard for a lot of films anyway. Spielberg does it. A lot of filmmakers do it. And so we did a lot of stuff on the Star Wars prequels where he edited the whole film together, and then we came back a year later and spent another 2 or 3 weeks shooting scenes and things that were cut, and revising it just to fix a story. But this was a shot in Raiders of the Lost Ark, and they needed an insert of Indy hooking his whip underneath the truck as he's being dragged underneath the truck. And so they got, this was the Skywalker Ranch fire truck, and they set it up, as you can see, in the parking lot there. And that's Mike Fulmer, one of the model makers, acting as Indy, and that's the shot from the film. So they actually used actual sunlight, real sunlight. They waited for the sun to get just right, and got sunlight in there. They shook the truck. They blasted some dust underneath, and then I got the shot. So this is actually, I don't think we have the video of it, but this is actually from Galaxy Quest. Here's a bit of that model. I'll show you this too, but this was, we didn't blow up everything, but unfortunately I don't think this, I'd be afraid to plug this in. I don't know if it still works. I could try, if anything explodes.
Fire extinguisher?
Yes, fire extinguisher standing by. Oh, yeah, it works. So this is all the thermians. I don't want to grab the wrong wires here. All the thermians watching the Galaxy Quest explode. Now, if you could see in there, it's actually film strips. So what we used was this is actually the actual footage from the scene. Let me hold this up. I'm afraid I'm going to get shocked here. They filmed them against a set, which is in the film, and then we actually asked them for the actual film, and so they gave it to us, and that's the actual 35 millimeter film. Can
you hold that up again, Don?
Yeah. I'm afraid all these exposed wires here, I'm get electrocuted. So, yeah, I think there were 6 of these units on the dock. I think they're in the background there, or maybe it might be a different section of it. The whole dock was a steel laser cut structure, and then we had these guys. We made one set and molded them over and over and over again. They had lights in them at one point, and that's what you could see, those little oval lights sitting over there. And the ship actually was never inside the model. The ship was shot separately from the model. This was one of those movies, got to work, like I said, I was real fortunate at the period of time I worked at ILM, and got to work on great films. This was one of the ones that I thought, oh, this is going to be a dog. I never, when we saw the dailies, particularly the sequence, it was all with no music, no proper sound, just people yelling out lines and stuff like that. And I think, oh, this looks really stupid. But it's one of my favorite films now. This was from Episode 1, Star Wars Episode 1. We did tons and tons of models. This is all a model, not the background area, obviously, and not the people walking, but it is all a model. One of the things that was great about working at ILM is that someone always had an answer, had a way of doing something, and we came up with the ideas like, well, they don't know if they could put digital crowds. They knew they needed to put crowds in there, but what could we use as a crowd? And one of the model makers, the guy that you saw looked like he was holding his breath underwater by the Pearl Harbor ship, Michael Lynch, came up with the idea, well, all you see is color. So he figured out roughly, like in a crowd, what kind of different colors you would see, people wearing hats, different clothes, and that sort of thing. Obviously, it's Star Wars, so his color was a little different. But, and he said, well, what if we use cotton swabs? So I don't know if you could see that, but those are all cotton swabs, and what there was chicken wire. There was chicken wire in underneath there, and all the cotton swabs, there was something like 350,000 cotton swabs. He came up with a method of painting all those cotton swabs, so obviously there was a batch of, you needed 50,000 of this color and 50,000 of that color or whatever. And then we had to come up with a way of like blending them all together. So there was like big vats where we just were like mixing it, like tossing a salad. And then we had to put them in, and it literally took several days for crews of people to just sit there and put them in there like that. And the other thing that they found out is that by blowing a fan underneath, they would move a little bit. so it looked like they had life to them. Now, not much of this you do ultimately see. That long shot is all the cotton swabs, but the close-up stuff, obviously they did shoot real people in a stand. But the more longer and medium shots are the cotton swabs. And the little figures in the middle were little toys. There was a company called Galoob that had little micro action figures. They were really tiny. So those figures are only about 3/4 of an inch tall. One of the guys got clever and thought, well, they should have their own toy. So that was that. With authentic Anchorhead sand, it says there, by the way. So. Yeah, they didn't sell those actually. They just it was done as a gag. This was one of the things I was lucky enough to be involved with was R2D2 and C3PO. So since 1987, I was the official R2D2 operator. Well, till about 2006 then. We for Episode 1, they had the new C3PO that was unclad. And so again, Michael Lynch is Mr. Cotton Swab guy. That's him behind C3PO. And we created a puppet. I did the head. There's a team of about 4 or 5 people that worked on it. And Michael puppeteered it from behind. And it's a Japanese-style puppeteering called bunraku. So his head is attached to the head, his chest is attached to the chest, and so forth and on, so he could do the motions of it. His feet are attached with plates to the feet, so you could actually walk and everything. It took a little bit of configuring, but the problem was that puppet was about 100 pounds, and having it sit, literally you're holding all that weight, here. So when Episode 2 came along, originally, this is Episode 1, originally in Episode 2, C3PO, when we first meet him on Tatooine, George had it written that C-3PO was still in this form. And so they didn't want to fly. I was in Sydney. We were shooting in Sydney, Australia. I was in Sydney. They didn't want to fly Michael out to puppeteer it. And they were going to have Anthony Daniels, the original actor that played C-3PO anyway, there. So they said, they wanted me to puppeteer it. And I'm thinking, we're going to be in the desert, this thing, I really don't want to do that. And then Tony Daniels, in all his actor wisdom, he says, I can do it. And so the problem is Tony's a small, slight guy. And this thing probably weighed about as much as he did. And plus he had a bad back too. So we were thinking of how we could adjust it and help him with that. And so the original rig that Michael's wearing in this picture is actually, he made it out of copper pipe, galvanized pipe. It's just plumbing pipe that he's wearing with pads on it, So it really rode on his shoulders, and so all that weight sitting on your shoulders like that. And so when we're getting ready, we're over in Sydney for Episode 2, and I'm thinking, how can we do this? And I happened to see the camera guy had his Steadicam there, and this, Steadicam is developed to distribute the weight on your hips and your shoulders and your chest and everything like that. So I thought, hey, well, that one, maybe we could do something like that. So we borrowed the Steadicam harness for a day, had to pay the cameraman a case of beer, and we started looking at it and trying it out. We put it on Tony, and we pushed down on it and everything like that. He said, yeah, this is comfortable. So he essentially made our own version of the Steadicam harness that he wore. And this is actually a cut scene from the original, from Attack of the Clones. This ended up getting changed. But so he wore that. And he was able to do the job. He did an amazing job, actually, as a puppeteer on it. He was quite brilliant. We had to do some other modifications. We made the thing a little bit more articulate because he liked to use his hands as C-3PO. I mean, the whole character is in the way he moved, so we wanted to really make it look like C-3PO. and we did all that work. We even had Steadicams, and there's a lighter weight versions of Steadicams now that you could buy very inexpensively. This was the really expensive 35 millimeter camera Steadicam harnesses, and they have a fail-safe feature in there so that if you fall over in the thing, there's a ripcord you could pull and you pop right out of the thing, or if you fall into the water, you could pull it out so it doesn't take you down with it. And we just, not so much as a joke, but just in case, we added that. Well, sure enough, we were shooting in Tunisia, in the Lars homestead, in the Hotel City Driss in Matinee. And Tony's puppeteering, and it's a very uneven surface, and he's walking along, and he went over, he fell over. And he broke off the legs of the puppet. And but he was laying with the thing on top of him, so we were able to pull the ripcord and get him out of there. And then we had to continue the shoot. So we were going along, and they realized again in the pickups. This is 6-8 months later. We're back in the States. In the pickups, they wanted C-3PO to walk down a flight of stairs as this puppet. Like, how are we going to do that? And so we realized that, well, if we're walking down the stairs, if the puppeteer can walk down the stairs, the character will just be floating out in front of them. So all they have to do is, because it's going to be green screen stairs anyway, they could just composite them into the right position. So we got this whole thing all rigged up. Michael ended up started going to perform C-3PO at ILM. We even had a safety line. We flew him. We had a line that in case he did fall off the stairs, he wouldn't fall. And we're literally getting him into the rig, and John Knoll, who was a visual effects supervisor, came on stage and says, "Hold on." And we're like, "What?" And he says, "George just cut the C-3PO sequences. He's back into his costume now." So when we first see him, he's in his weathered costume. It's like, huh. So then we had to get, we had said, "Sorry, Michael," and Michael left, and we brought Grant Imahara in because Grant was our stand-in C-3PO whenever we did C-3PO. So Grant came in, and we did Grant walking down the stairs in the costume, and then so all this stuff was cut. We even, for this sequence, which we shot in Sydney, at the very end of the thing, at the very end, after he's sitting in the garage, the whole sequence is he's sitting in the garage with Natalie Portman, Padme, and Anakin is off killing sand people somewhere, and so she's feeling very sad, and C-3PO standing there saying yes, he feels sad too because he feels naked. It's a really corny scene, and she says, "Well, but there happened to be a box of coverings right here," and he goes, "Oh, I never noticed that." And so she takes it, and she takes the first piece and starts putting on, cut off to Anakin killing the sand people, come back, and she's finishing up by putting the faceplate on, and that's what this rig is. She's putting a faceplate on. So we had magnets in the faceplate, because that's not how the suit really goes together. And they were going to digitally replace Anthony's face with the puppet face, and then he was going to do that. So, but they cut all that. So, and so he was just in the suit the entire time. So that's the mask going on. So, and there's her. I guess she's happier now. I'm not sure. So, but so yeah. So the other things one of the things that they always used to call it the ILM Body Parts Club. Everyone got to, somewhere along the line, got to be a part of a body or a human or a performer. And this was for the Jedi, it was called Jedi Rocks. It was Return of the Jedi, new music sequence that they put in. And that's my friend Nelson and I. We were the two of the band members so we were in costumes. It was very hot that day. We were sweating like very hot. And that same day, I also got to play Boba Fett, talking to the dancers too. So, and then I also got to play Indiana Jones once, but that's another story. So this is actually when we're in a special edition filming the Wampa snow creature. George directing. Howie Weed is the guy in the suit. He's again another creature guy, And I think I was just giving him error there. Another thing we did over the years was the Energizer Bunny commercial. The original Energizer Bunny was done by a company down in Los Angeles, and their contract expired. Something happened. I'm not quite sure what was going on, but we got the job to do the Energizer Bunny. So the Energizer Bunny was actually a little robotic, remote-controlled puppet. You could see Scott's up there holding the remote control, and it actually beat the drums. And truth in advertising, it had to run on Energizer batteries. So we actually, inside the drum is something like 100 AA batteries, and we made special packs, and it helped with the balance of the puppet and everything like that. But its head could move and nod, and it beat the drum. It even had, Grant Imahara did the electronics for it, and it even had a sound card in it, so you could hear the boom, 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 boom. And we got to do, before we got the job, I got to do another gig with the Energizer Bunny. Again, it was prior to us doing the Bunny. It was a series of commercials that they did in the early 90s. It was called the Get the Bunny campaign. And the idea was that the bunny would face a whole bunch of famous movie villains from over the years. And in one of them, it was Darth Vader. So I worked with the bunny and Darth Vader on that one. This is actually just in response to, just yesterday, Peter Mayhew died, Chewbacca. So this was, so it was just announced yesterday. And Peter, I've known Peter since 1988, 87 or something like that. And this was during Revenge of the Sith filming. And this was the first time he tried on the costume for Revenge of the Sith. So everyone was taking their, not all of them as awkwardly as I had. So this actually leads into something else, that the film that you'll see if you're coming to the film festival tomorrow, Keep the Gaslight Burning. Dave and Lou Elsey, the couple that directed it, are friends, and we met on Revenge of the Sith, and they were the creature designers for Revenge of the Sith, and so they created Peter's costume. And so we had been friends since 2003 or so, whenever we first met, so 16 years. And a few years ago, we decided, we had stayed in touch, we talked about doing projects together, and a few years ago, we decided we should just make a movie. And so we did, and that's what Keep the Gaslight Burning is. Dave happened to have a script. I said, hey, well, come, I've got a crew, we can find a house in Petaluma, and we made a movie. And so we did, from the time that we had that meeting until the time we were actually shooting was 63 days. We put together a crew, Bill, who you met, was our cinematographer. And tomorrow at the screening will be also Jay Shilladay, who's our sound designer, will be there. One of our actors, Maureen Studer, and my wife, who's a co-producer. And we got Marky Post, who, if you ever remember the TV show Night Court from the 80s, she's in it. She's the main lady. Her daughter, who is an actress that lives in New York, is in it, and the first time they ever acted together. And then Rick Baker, who, if you follow makeup at all, he's 8-time, 7-time, I don't know how many Academy Awards he's won. He did American Werewolf in London, Thriller, King Kong, Planet of the Apes, a whole bunch of stuff. And he's our ghost. So, and Marky and Rick are friends with Dave and Lou. So it was kind of like, when we said, I can get a crew, he says, I think I can get Marky to play in it. I said, and I bet you Rick will do the ghost. So, anyway, so we put it together, came along real quickly. We rented the house. It's right next to the FedEx office on Washington, right kind of across from the Target Center. It's called the Martin Farmhouse, built in 1908. And we rented that for a week and shot there. And yeah, it was all local production. But this was discussed. This is sort of a character in the film. It's called Keep the Gaslight Burning. The idea is that Mrs. Maxwell, our heroine, has to keep the gaslight burning in the house, or her dead husband will come back and kill her. And So I won't tell you how it ends, but this is a gas meter that a prop I made for the film. And this was just, I was going to show us a little bit of the thought process behind coming up with the thing. The idea of a gas meter was not that popular in the United States. The story that we based the movie on was actually a short story written by a British author. Dave and Lou, our directors, happen to be British. And so so the idea of a gas meter, a coin-fed gas meter, was not that popular in the United States. It did happen in the U.S., particularly in tenement buildings in the East Coast in the 1800s or so. But we did research that, and it's like, okay, well, it could happen. So, because we set our film in the South, because even though it was a British story, we didn't want to challenge our actors into having to do fake British accents. So we thought the Southern accent would be a little bit easier for them to pull off, and it was. And the interesting thing was the syntax and the rhythm of the dialogue worked for both British and Southern. So that was an interesting observation that we found. But anyway, so we had to create a gas meter because they don't really exist anymore. If they do, they're in antique stores, and they're worth a lot of money. So so I started looking around. One of the first things I do when I try to create something is, I go to real things. And so I saw this sign. I thought this would be perfect sign. So if you see how it says the poly sliding locking device, see it says pennies only. I copied the style almost exclusively. This was the paint finish, the color. I thought this would be great for it, as opposed to going red because that would be too blatant with blood. I thought green would be a little bit better. This is an actual gas meter from a period gas meter. And then this was essentially the model. This was a real one from London, and I stole most of the concept from this one. And if you go back and see it, I mean, the essential body is there. So it's got the lockbox on the right there with the coin slot. We had to put the coin slot differently because we wanted to see the hand coming in from the right of the frame and put the coin in. And we also had to have a big obvious thing that says empty and full because it's a key point, so those wouldn't have had that. And then the two brass things are obviously where the gas pipes go. So that, there was just a little bit of the thought process behind it. That's what it looks like in the film.
How do you fabricate that?
So the body was, I happen to have access to both 3D printer and laser cutter. But the thing is full size, so it's about that big. So the main body is plastic, wood, that sort of thing. The letters are laser cut. The detail, the trim work is 3D printed. The knob is actually, the turning knob is actually a real faucet knob. So a lot of the detail is laser cut. I put a radio control servo in the meter so that we could, by radio control, just make it go. And then and it's painted. The paint finish is I took Bondo, car putty, and stippled it on with a sponge and a brush, and then I took acetone over that and worked it until I got the right texture, and then just painted it with an out of the can, straight out of the can thing. So, but that's my presentation. So I hope you come see the movie. Try to find that other. There's there's a. So it's this one. Okay. So here's another. Just a little quick video here. I'll just do that. Yeah. There we go. This is a quick video we did. It was actually shot a week after we shot Keep the Gaslight Burning. It was a commercial that never aired. It was for a video game called Clash of Kings. And that's the Petaluma. You'll recognize Petaluma. We shot Mare Island and Petaluma. We used the same crew that we shot Gaslight. We shot Gaslight on a Sunday, Monday. And this was shot Saturday, Sunday, the following weekend. See if it...
Where to? Careful.
There you go. Yeah. So there was a lot of there's some digital fixes in that one. The zombies we had to get rid of. Stop that. We had to get rid of eye pupils. All the car shots were green screen with plates. I just drove around Petaluma with my truck with a camera pointing out the back and got all those plates. Yeah. So, questions? Yeah.
Are there any good books on this subject with like practical effects?
ILM put out. They're old now. There was, I think, they did 3 versions of those. One that was, I think, back in it must have been the 80s. And then there was one that they updated after Jurassic Park came out, so it was like late 90s, early 2000s. And I think they've done one since. One of the, I mean, if you can pick up the old Cinefex magazines or online, that's got the best resources of all that. A number of the artists themselves have had their own books written. Matter of fact, Rick Baker, who's in our film, makeup artist, he's got one coming out, being published by Petaluma Company, in fact, that's coming out at Halloween. So there's a number of books out there from those guys, but yeah, unfortunately, it's a dying art. You know, it's they're not much of us around anymore. So yeah.
Is there regarding the set paintings, the background paintings, like at a plane on the dock, they were painted on glass. What's the practical reason to choose glass over some other?
They weren't always painted on glass. Sometimes they were painted on masonite, but the glass allowed them to project the film from behind while they're painting, so they could see where they could go. And sometimes they did do that. Sometimes they actually projected the film through the glass and composited it all in one shot. But a lot of times it was it was blocked. They would like matte out the area they didn't want and blend it together in the optical printer.
So in the old days, we have them on set and shoot.
Yeah, not only matte paintings, that's a hanging matte. They also did miniatures that way, which is a real effective technique where you put the scale model, or in that case the painting, right in front of the camera and shoot through it, and then it looks like there's a castle right there or something. They did that. I know they used to do they had 2 Ewok movie TV shows that they did, and they did a castle that way. So.
The wind, I think the whole Antigua and Tara.
Mm-hmm.
It was just a tiny little set, and then the rest of it was matte.
Yeah, the other movie that has a ton of matte paintings in there, a lot of people don't realize, is Citizen Kane. Yeah, they're just like him walking through a doorway, and they just had the doorway, and the rest is all a painting. So, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, there's amazing pullback where they start on Charles Lawton and keep pulling back, and it's all a matte painting of Notre Dame. So yeah, what always struck me and what fascinated me about it, I've always been a bit of a gearhead, where trying to figure out how they did stuff, and to have that technology. And them figuring it out back then with what limited things they had at their working within their means, and it's kind of one of the things that being able to bridging from the film world to the digital world now, where you just keep shooting. You just leave the camera on. You just keep shooting and everything. When we shot film, you didn't do that because there was money going through the camera, So you cut right when you needed to, and you weren't shooting until you were really ready. Even big productions, it didn't matter how big a production it was. They just didn't waste film that way. Not to mention, you only had so much film in a magazine anyway. But so that's one of the things that's kind of lost, is the preciousness of the medium. And also the ability to, I think, particularly with, like, say George's movies, his earlier movies were better because he was limited to what he could do, budget-wise, time-wise, or whatever. And I think that's one of the greatest things as an artist that you could do. It's like, how am I going to make this? Well, I've got this, bottle, and I've got this, keychain. Let's make something out of it, you know. And I think film is that should be that way, or any art should be that way. Is that you try to limit yourself as much as possible, and because it's so easy now. You know, everybody, you got a whole film studio right there on the computer. You know, could you pretty much do anything? But should you? So, yeah.
You said you worked at CWI?
Yeah.
Did you work on the wonderfully Academy Award-winning film Fly 2?
I did. How do you know about that? Did you see it?
Mike Jones is a good friend.
Oh yeah, Mike. Yeah, I work with Mike now, right down the street.
He's
Yeah.
still in model making?
He's a mold maker. So one of the things that we did, we're a spin-off of a spin-off of a spin-off of the model shop. We're making trauma training mannequins for the military, and now first responders as well. We're again literally around the corner, right by the fire station over on Corona and North McDowell. So we took our movie making experience of making realistic creatures and monsters and people, and make realistic humans with horrible injuries. And Mike's the head of the mold shop there. So we design and make those. And they're very disturbing for some people. So. But that's actually part of the thing, is that what they wanted to do, what the military wanted to do, was have a visceral feeling when these people come around the corner. So they come around the corner and see this realistic human, you know, writhing in pain because they move, or things move, they breathe, and there's, you know, legs are missing and they're squirting blood and that sort of thing. So it really, you know, you see the guys like go in and go, oh, you know, before they go. And also other things like, you know, having to touch parts of people's bodies that you normally don't want to touch or whatever, you know. So, but, yeah.
So I came in after you showed the trailer you mentioned.
Want to see it? Want to see it again?
So you have experience doing like model making and the creature stuff, but do you have? You were talking about the dummies with the injuries. Do you do a lot of like
Makeup.
FX stuff?
Yeah, well, I when I was younger in Chicago, I worked on I got fascinated with makeup initially. Planet of the Apes was a big thing, and yeah, and then Dick Smith, who was the makeup artist. Yeah, and the godfather of makeup, and of course then Rick Baker as well, and so I was really into that sort of stuff, and then so I got and I was doing theater. I didn't have an outlet to do film. I really wanted to do film, but theater was the closest thing I could do. So I was doing a lot of theater in Chicago, and I was designing sets. I've done a bunch of different things. I don't know if all of them well, but I've done a bunch of different things. And I love that. I love the fact that being able to be as well-rounded as possible, I think really helps as a filmmaker too, because you know what everyone's dealing with, going through it. Anyway, I sent my portfolio out. They were looking for people to work on The Fly out here in San Rafael. And I sent my portfolio out with all this makeup stuff and everything like that. And I also I was 16 when Star Wars came out. I also built my own full-size radio-controlled R2-D2. And that's the thing that he hung on it to. He goes, he didn't, I don't think he thought my makeup stuff was that good, but he thought, well, wait, you can do mechanical stuff? It's like, yeah. And that was kind of a side thing for me. And he's like, well, you know how to use a mill and a lathe? Like, yeah, sure. And I had to go look up what a mill was. I didn't know what a mill was. And you always say yes when they ask you, do you know how to do it? Yeah. And so I did, and it came out. So I got sidelined into just doing mechanical type stuff and a little bit of mold making and that sort of stuff. So I've been around the whole makeup world and that kind of stuff, but I don't personally have as much experience with it. So. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you happen to know what type of lens was used for the early shot of the Star Destroyer in Star Wars? At
Like,
the beginning?
yeah, what?
It was some kind of really close to the model.
Yeah, I know. It was really wide. I'm want to say it was like a 12 millimeter or something like that. I don't know, but I probably could find out. But I know that they got close enough that they scraped the model. And you know that model in the opening shot of the first Star Wars is only 3 feet long. So they flipped it upside down. The camera came over it like that, and they kept knocking chips off of it, you know, as it was coming along. That was a common error with the camera guys with the motion control thing. We were always on set with our models with the motion control cameraman because they were always running into them and hitting them. And so we were always having to fix them up. And like get a call, it's like, oh, okay.
Dexter's setup, isn't it?
That one, originally one was, yeah. And yeah, the Dykstra Flex is now apparently the Academy, in the Academy Museum that they're opening in Southern California, yeah. So you'll be able to see that. You know, all those things got rebuilt over the years, over and over and over again. So, but yeah.
Do you have any tips for anyone wanting to get into this sort of thing?
LA, because I mean, any of the, there's nothing up here anymore, unfortunately. There used to be at one point for practical effects, model effects. It was ILM. There was actually, well, Tippett Studios does a little bit of it, but they mainly do all digital stuff. There is up in Oregon is the guys at Leica, which did Coraline and yeah, and they're doing 2 films up there, Pinocchio, which is Guillermo del Toro, I think, and I don't think they're doing it at there. I think he's opening his own facility like down the street from them. And they're doing something else. I can't remember what movie they're doing. So there's a big stop motion set up down there. They tried doing it a few years ago. Henry Selick, who did Nightmare Before Christmas, and James and the Giant Peach, animation supervisor, and Coraline, I believe. He opened up a studio again in San Francisco, and they had a whole bunch of artists working there. And unfortunately, they worked for like 2 years or something and produced only like 10 seconds of film or something like that. It was a Disney project. Disney cut the film and everyone disbanded. And now a lot of those people are up there. And a lot of the people that are up in Portland are also from Nightmare and Before Christmas and that. And then in Southern California is all the big makeup effects labs. So what used to be Stan Winston's company, which is a Legacy Effects now. There's also Alec Gillis and Tom Woodruff, can't remember the name of their company, that did Alien, the Alien sequel, Alien 3 on. And yeah, there's quite a few of them down there. And it's actually the makeup side of things. I thought, you know, that seemed to be the first to go in the digital world, you know, creature stuff, particularly like the big T-Rex that they did in Jurassic Park, where you don't need to build a big robot anymore. You could just have, you know, a guy with a rubber blue sock. But the makeup and creature stuff seems to have resurged, whereas the model stuff seems to have really disappeared more. So, yeah. The thing is, the other interesting thing, I had, like I said, I had my own shop here in Petaluma for a little bit, and what I was finding was that the people that were doing the hiring, the agencies, the commercial companies, and that sort of thing, don't know how this stuff was done. And so there was always this education, is like you're trying to tell them, well, you don't have to do that way. We could just, you know, I did this commercial for. It was a car company where you buy online, you know, online car. I can't remember the name. I can't remember the name of the car company. Anyway, the idea was they're car heads, and so joke was they all had cars for heads. So we made about 6 model cars that theoretically could have fit over these people's head, but they didn't want to do it that way. So they filmed the guys with a blue sock, the actors with a blue sock over their head with a piece of foam core to give the shadow. And they walked through their scene, and then we had a puppeteer walk through the scene with ours, and they composited the 2 together. It's like, you know, we could have just put the heads on them. But no, they didn't do it that way. So, I mean, there's kind of thinking that you start running into. It's like, well, wait a minute, you know, why don't we think how we used to do stuff? So, fortunately, the people that are in charge that are doing that aren't around anymore that know how the others, or they don't have the history, you know. So. Well, thank you. No, sorry.
Is there any model or anything that you worked on through the years that really holds a special place in your heart?
Sort of, yeah. The first time we did the Pirates of the Caribbean, the Black Pearl, that was really cool because I had just come off of the Matrix sequels, which we set up a model shop over in Alameda to do. And all that was like, it seemed to be like everything we were making was pipes with junk on it, you know. So, and then prior to that, I had been working on Star Wars, and that's all, you know, futuristic space stuff. So we got to do Pirates of the Caribbean, and it's like, wow, this is like, you know, old school, like you know, 1,000-year-old craft, learning how to, even though we were using modern technology and stuff to do it, we were still building the ship like it was. So that was kind of cool. My favorite thing that I did was at the end of Revenge of the Sith, the mask that goes on Darth Vader. I did the interior. I did that mask. So, yeah.
Do you have any tips or recommendations for building six-way armatures on vehicles so you can shoot it from all six sides?
You mean where the, like?
Where the pipe from the C-stand or whatever would go in?
Well, the way that.
Like holes in all six sides.
Yeah, the way they did that was literally a block in the middle, you know, of the model. I take it back. Sometimes it depends on the shape of the model. They would have an armature that would have the mounting block, and a lot of times the four you know blocks, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the pipe that came out of it would be 5 and 6. So because again, if the spaceship was long, you know, those points would always be as close to the surface as possible. So they would have that usually the way, and then you try to find the center of gravity of the piece so that, you know, which isn't always easy before you're building the model, but you can kind of guess. Like the X-wings, the model on the X-wing, right where the cockpit is where the mounting block was. So there's 2 panels on the side, right? Kind of like if this was where the guy's sitting. There's 2 panels on the side that popped off. That's where those were. And then R2-D2's behind him was the top one, and then there was one underneath that came up. And then the nose cone would come off for the front one, and then there was a detail piece that came off for the back one. So.
Were they always threaded?
No, not always. Well, again, it depended on the model and how heavy it was. A lot of times the rod going in would have a flat on it, and so you'd have a set screw. So you'd have to have an access to get in there and tighten the thing down. Other times they were, you know, you would just crank. It would just be threaded. I think the X-wings were all threaded, but they were lighter. They're small. They're not that big. But something like the Millennium Falcon would have had to have a proper. Yeah, the Millennium Falcon they made for Star Wars, the original Star Wars, is 4 feet in diameter. And that thing weighed a ton. It actually took 3 people to lift it. So, yeah. And then they made a lighter weight version for Empire Strikes Back. Yeah.
Any predictions or insider information on kind of mind-blowing new next-gen technology that's going to be coming out in kind of your general space?
You know, I haven't worked in the effects industry now for a while, so I'm not quite up on it. I mean, you know, the thing that I see, I know that, I mean, I've used in more recent things, and it is kind of the big thing to go, is this blending of digital and physical technology, of, you know, 3D printing and those kinds of technologies. So I know that 3D printing is you know, kind of a big thing right now, at least for me, some of the stuff I've been doing, and the technologies, and that just keeps getting better and better. That kind of, and the material, the durability of that material. I mean, all the stop motion stuff now is, all those puppets, a lot of the faces are all 3D printed, and what's great is they do all the poses, you know, digitally, and then print the different expressions of the mouth things, and then just do replacement animation, and it's
That's
a great.
That's what my brother did on Coraline, actually.
Oh, really? Yeah.
His credit is Face Wrangler.
Yeah.
And he took me into the hangar, the production, you know, universe on Thanksgiving when they were still working on it, and I got to see all of the stage sets, all of the, you know, 3D, I saw the 3D printer and all the 3D printed models, and then all the faces that had little magnets embedded in the back,
Yeah.
so they could rapidly switch them out frame by frame, and that was my brother's job. Is
And they had boxes, right, with all that. Yeah.
hundreds of thousands
Yeah.
of different facial expressions,
Yeah.
and like my mind was fully blown.
The-
And so impressed with the work that they do there.
Yeah, and it's a great blend. And then of course, then they clean up the seams digitally after the fact. I mean, you know, some of the stuff too in the more recent movies is somewhat more success than others. You know, the digital de-aging that they've done. You know, sometimes it's good, and a couple times it doesn't work as good. But you know, stuff like that they did in Benjamin Button too. That was amazing. Some amazing stuff. I think when they have the time to do it right, you know, that's when it happens. One of the interesting things about just the facial expressions, the guy that was the predecessor to Leica, so Leica used to be Will Vinton Studios, and Will Vinton basically got fired from his own company eventually, and the Nike kid took it over, whoever the director is there now, but Will Vinton used to do the claymation stuff, and he would do all those sculpts in clay, on camera. You know, all the expressions and everything like that was done more or less by stop motion. And again, the artistry and the technology that you see that he would do with that stuff. Some of his early claymation stuff was just amazing.
Yeah, having to smooth the fingerprints.
Yeah.
God, I can only imagine.
Yeah, and they didn't have the digital technology to clean it up after the fact. Yeah. So there you go.
Before we head out, my name's Clay Atchison. I teach the 3D modeling and animation program. We have a 2-year program here at the college. And if you're interested in visual effects, that'll be rolling out next spring, but this fall we're rolling out our virtual reality course. So we have some new coursework coming online.
And that's a great new technology too.
Yeah, when you talked about new technology, that's where a lot of this stuff is headed. So.
Yeah, we were looking at the company that I'm working at. We were looked at that for trying to incorporate it in some way with our mannequins. And I just saw a video of where the New York Police Department were working with a company.
Exactly, for training.
Yeah, for training, where they're wearing the VR stuff and they're in a relatively realistic scenario.
Situations where you wouldn't be too durable as a human.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Yeah. And so we're in the Applied Technology Department at Tech, if you check this out. And this was fantastic and astounding. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So thank you for volunteering your time, coming and sharing that with us. When I first emailed down, I was like, I don't know they're going to be that interested. It was really fascinating and great. Our next workshops at 3:30 will be, 1:30. We'll be here, so it'll be time to get some lunch, and we'll be back in here 1:30 after the workshop. And then after that is another one at 4, and then festival tomorrow. So hope to see you all later.